My name's Scott Malcolmson. I'm Director of Communications at International Crisis Group, talking with Piers Pigu and Trevor Mysiri, who are Piers is the Project Director for Southern Africa, and Trevor Mysiri is the Senior Analyst, both joining us from Johannesburg. They've just completed work on a report on election scenarios in Zimbabwe. I might start with you, Piers. The global political agreement that came about following violence in 2008 in Zimbabwe was meant to lead to a peaceful political process, with President Robert Mugabe of the ZANU-PF party continuing as president, and Morgan Tsvangirai of the Movement for Democratic Change as prime minister. There is a deadline for elections coming up. The government President Mugabe's side wants it to be in June. That seems like it'll be delayed. Could you explain to us just briefly what the nature of the crisis is politically between these two parties over the question of whether and when to hold an election?
The election date remains a site of contestation, along with many other problems in Zimbabwe. As you've indicated, ZANU-PF is calling for an early election. This is for a number of reasons, not least because their presidential candidate is 89 years old, and they are concerned that the longer the election process is delayed, the less likely he is able to mount a vigorous campaign for the election. Most people are expecting this to be a relatively close-run election, and the ZANU-PF's political fortunes have recovered somewhat under the auspices of the Government of National Unity, the inclusive government that came out of the global political agreement. The MDC formations, both of them, have been calling for a set of reforms to be put in place that relate essentially to media and the security sector, and the reconciliation of existing laws with the new constitution that has been adopted. And as we speak, this matter is being discussed in Zimbabwe's Senate at the moment and is expected to come into law during the course of the next couple of weeks. So there's a major contestation over what reforms are still required before an election can proceed, with those arguing for reforms opting for a longer range view, arguing for elections around August, September, possibly even October. The last constitutionally, the last date is going to be the end of October, around the 28th of October, for an election. Although there is still an option for a further constitutional amendment which could postpone elections further.
And in terms of the violence in 2008, we have a short video here that gives a feeling for just how severe that was.
Saka pandakadzoka ndakaona chiedza vanhu vari kumhanya kubva pamba pangu vari 2. Munext door wangu anoitwa Phineas Kamhapa nacandidate MP Newton Kachepa vachitaura kuti hatisi kuda kumbonza zvinonzi MDC kuno kumudzi. Saka within 20 minutes vabva ipapo ndakaona youth yeZANU-PF vakapfeka maT-shirt ndobva vasvika kuti iwewe ndiwe mukuru wacho iwewe, vatanga kunditema nematombo payapa. Mumwe wacho vakandirova nesimbi pagumba pa ndikabva ndadonha pasi, vada kundirova mumusoro. Saka ndakada kuedza kuti ndibva ndiri kubva ndirova ruoko bva rachikoka. Kubva ipapo handichatanzoziva kuti chii chakazoitika, vakangondondirova pese pese.
How much popular enthusiasm is there within Zimbabwe for an election? I mean, the violence in 2008 was extremely dramatic, and it wasn't that long ago. While in terms of the political agreement, it's obvious that there should be an election because it's been agreed to, but at the popular level, is there a lot of enthusiasm for it?
It's difficult to say. We've just had a constitutional referendum in which, if the figures are to be believed, the biggest turnout ever in a Zimbabwean election occurred. Over 3.3 million people, we are told, voted in this referendum, which displays a remarkable increase in participation. Almost 1 million more people participated in the referendum than in the 2008 elections. Now, of course, there was a different criteria in the election processes where you have to be registered on the voters' roll. This is not necessary in the referendum process, but it's an indicator, if indeed it is true, and there are some questions about the veracity of that turnout, around the turnout, but it could well be an indicator of a hunger amongst a number of people in Zimbabwe to vote. But having said that, I should point out that 3.3 million people is still probably only around 50 to 55% of the total number of eligible voters in the country. We don't know, actually. I mean, and this is one of the problems that we have in Zimbabwe, is that there is not detail on how many adults there are in the country, despite a recent census process, and we still do not have access to the latest version of the voters' roll, despite a cabinet directive to that effect almost a month ago.
Speaking of numbers that are hard to find, you spoke earlier about the movement for democratic change, that it has two factions, one of which, the one associated with Prime Minister Tsvangirai, is considerably larger, but at least according to some reports, which you have mentioned in your report, that some of the support for that MDC dominant faction is declining. Is there any way really to know what the relative strengths of the different political factions are in terms of an eventual election result?
One of the problems with the material that's available in terms of opinion polls, and we've seen this for a number of years over the last decade in Zimbabwe, and in particular since the government of national unity was put in place, is that a significant chunk of all opinion polls, somewhere between 40 and 50% in some of the polls, refuse or are unable to tell you what their election preferences are. So what we can say is that overt support for the MDC has declined significantly from almost 60% in 2009 to under 30% in 2012, whereas conversely, ZANU-PF's overt support, people prepared to put their name next to ZANU-PF, has risen in the same period from 9% to over 30%. So we've seen varying fortunes as it relates to people willing to put their head out and say what they would vote for. But we still have this enormous chunk of people who are not prepared to put their are not prepared to disclose who they would vote for. This, Scott, I should point out, reflects the politics of fear in the Zimbabwean context, in which people fear that this kind of information, these are polls that are run by non-governmental organizations, but one of the questions that is asked in these polls is, who do you think is running these opinion polls? And most people think that this is some kind of government initiative, a political initiative that is there to out them.
When you spoke about the politics of fear, let's look now at a short video from last year on that very point.
Kuno kutaenda kagara zvakanaka fani kuwadi inanya hunure. Pampasisina asi pampasisina kutaudzana maningi. Kana kuti kupopotedzana kana kuita mhirishonga pampasina. Taitoti zvanyarara. Zvino zvinenge zvakutangisa zvekare. Izvi ndazviona kuti ndezvematongo wenyika chaiyo zvakiitika zvizvi.
Could you talk a little bit about the South African aspect of this in terms of regional diplomacy and the Southern African Development Committee, which is meant to play a key diplomatic role in ensuring political progress in Zimbabwe? Where is that now? Is that stalled or is that moving forward?
What you realize is that South Africa has been involved at two levels. The first level was the initiation of the Global Political Agreement, which was mediated by SADC through South Africa. And now South Africa is playing another role, which is to facilitate the implementation of the Global Political Agreement until we see what is considered to be a credible election. But however, in as much as there's been a lot of challenges at the regional level in terms of ensuring that the global political agreement sees its life, and that the prerequisite reforms that are stated in that agreement are also realized.
Is it your feeling that there's much enthusiasm left within SADC or the Southern African Development Committee for this kind of work?
I think it's a modus operandi of SADC to proverbially kick the can down the road. It certainly has changed its position on Zimbabwe. We see over the last 2 or 3 years a distinct hardening of its position. But we must be realistic about what is going to be achieved through this body in the foreseeable future. This is why we believe that SADC has really moved from a reform agenda to a containment agenda, in which stability and the maintenance of stability remains paramount.
And lastly, if you could just talk briefly, leaving SADC aside, are there other, well, and bearing in mind, of course, that the UN Election Monitoring Commission was rejected, are there other significant levers of international pressure, whether from the UN or from other major players on the continent, or is again, I mean, is it mostly a situation where Zimbabwe is really being left to work out its own really quite intractable political difficulties?
Yeah, Scott, there's been a change in terms of how much the international community has been involved in Zimbabwe. And what we have seen is that in the last 3 to 4 years, we have seen SADC take a frontline role in dealing with the situation in Zimbabwe. And when SADC put its foot forward to take charge of the Zimbabweans, we also realized that SADC managed to convince most members of the international community to work behind the SADC initiative so as to reduce the number of parallel processes that were being followed in terms of trying to put pressure on the Zimbabwean case. So what you see at the moment is you see a reconfiguration where SADC is in the forefront of pushing the Zimbabwean case, and a lot of the international community players sort of like either working behind SADC or are in a muted form. But however, of concern to us is the situation whereby we are starting to see a lot of compromises around positions that were taken earlier on by members of the international community to try and bring about prospects for democratic transition in Zimbabwe.
Piers Bigu and Trevor Maisiri in Johannesburg, thank you very much.